I'm Conor, Senior Researcher at the Intergenerational Foundation. We're a research charity fighting for a fairer deal for younger and future generations in the UK. We work on some of the big policy challenges shaping the lives of young people, from housing and student finance to taxation, the labour market and the environment. Our work focuses on exposing intergenerational unfairness and proposing practical evidence-based reforms. In this new podcast series, we'll be speaking to some of the UK's leading experts about the issues that matter most for younger and future generations. My guest today is Cameron Garrett, Deputy Director of Research at More in Common. Cameron joined More in Common after around 8 years at Ipsos, where he worked in the politics and central government team. He has extensive experience in managing major electoral surveys, which includes the 2024 British election study, and moderating focus groups on politically sensitive topics. And More in Common itself has done a lot of research on public opinion, political trust, social cohesion, and the changing state of British politics. So today we'll be speaking with Cameron about intergenerational fairness and democracy. So what do younger people want from politics? Why do so many feel alienated from the mainstream political parties? And how our political system can better respond to the needs and interests of younger and future generations. So Cameron, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Conor. What an introduction.
So you've spent a lot of your career working on public opinion, polling, focus groups, and electoral research. So I think the best place to start is probably with how you first came to this type of work. Why do you find it interesting? And what do you think good research on public opinion can pick up that Westminster and other places sometimes fail to notice?
Yep. For my sins, I've been doing it for my whole career so far. And I kind of stumbled into it after university. I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do. I'd done a history degree and I knew I was interested in politics. And I'd followed the polls throughout elections and I'd heard of some of these big polling agencies and decided, that sounds interesting, and a way in. And I actually think I kind of got there by accident, but I've stayed because I think it's a really foundational way of hearing actually what the public think and escaping that Westminster bubble. I think public opinion research is so important because we only have elections every so often, right? And local elections interspersed in between. But how are we actually tracking how people think about the government in between that? And the public opinion research is letting us do that. So we know everyone's annoyed at Keir Starmer right now. He's got a net satisfaction rating of -48. But we're seeing that because people are actually going out weekly and doing these polls and putting them out to people and capturing what people think. And then also, more broadly, we're able to see those wider societal trends. So some of those studies that you mentioned up front, like the British election study, has been running for decades. And we're able to see how British society is changing and evolving on some of those big cultural societal issues. So you can look back and see trends about how we've become more approving on things like race or same-sex marriage, and just showing there's a public consensus on that, which then allows politics to catch up and say, okay, we can do something there on that. I think sometimes public opinion research can get a bad rap, saying politics is paying too much attention to polls and being led by what happens in focus groups. But I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what a good focus group should do. Definitely, you should not be going to a focus group and looking to create policy in that focus group. You should be coming with your argument or your narrative or your policy and then actually testing it with the public and seeing, okay, how did that land? This is what we want to do. How can their concerns, how can we reassure them when we actually do launch this and go public with it? Are there any tweaks we need to make to think, young people might be really disadvantaged here, and they pick up on that? What can we change? So it's about refining policy and testing it, not necessarily creating it.
Can you give a bit of a sense, because often we hear a lot about focus groups and there is a bit of a critique of government by focus group. Yeah. How do they actually work? What's the setup look like?
Yep. So increasingly now they're online on Zoom. When I started out in my career, I was dotted about rooms in pubs across the country. But we work with recruiters, so recruiter agencies who it's a mixture of they will find people on the street and they will go out to the high street and we will set them some quotas and say we want to speak to this number of people from this age group, this gender, this social group, and sometimes you might mix it up, but you're trying to get a broadly representative picture of people. And now we are online, that is better. If you want about 6 or 8 people, so it's a really small sample, you don't want people to be going away and quantifying from it and saying, oh, well, actually I did that focus group and most people think this, so we shouldn't do that. That's what a quant survey's for. But it's to really uncover, okay, you're against that. Why are you against it? What are your concerns? So in the early days of the government, we saw lots of concerns about the winter fuel allowance, for example. And what actually is your concern there? Lots of young people were also concerned about it, even though it was something that might not necessarily affect them, but they were immediately jumping to their grandparents and saying, well, actually, I'm worried about them. I know they're lonely sitting in the cold, etc.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think we'll come back to the winter fuel a little bit later when we're talking about generational voters. I'd be really curious if you could tell me a little bit more about some of the recent work you've done on the 7 segments of voters across the British electorate, and what the kind of project set out to achieve, and then what did it find?
So I guess it's unsurprising that politics is becoming increasingly fragmented, and people are going to different parties. So at last month's local elections, we saw a big surge for Green and Reform against the traditional parties. And I guess what the segmentation we wanted to do was kind of get below partisan politics and say, okay, this is what people are voting and we're fragmented, but what are the attitudinal beliefs which are driving people to different parties, and go a bit more upstream with it, essentially, and get below just like demographics of, okay, so young man, young women might vote this or that. What is it fundamental to their beliefs? So we did a large survey and then we segmented them. Our clever stats people ran some clustering where you see people, how they answered the survey, and you develop into clusters, and then we kind of develop and give life to them. On the left half of the segment, you have your progressive activists who are quite young. They feel quite hard done by society, and they're increasingly voting Green now. Their enemies would call them woke. They're very big on campaigning on issues like the environment, like housing, etc. Then you have the incrementalist left, who I kind of see as the last Starmerites in Britain. They agree with lots of the progressive activists on their beliefs, but they're a bit less radical in it. They don't necessarily want to tear the system down. They believe in more gradual change and maybe Labour will get there. We just need to give them a bit more time. Then you have your established liberals who are a bit more affluent. They're living out kind of in the shires. They've been fought over by the Conservative and the Lib Dems in recent elections, and they're very much institutionalists. They like institution. They really love the NHS, the BBC, things that make, they don't necessarily love the Bank of England, but things that make Britain, they really get behind, and they're a bit wary about, on the fringes, people are saying, oh, we need to tear the whole system down there. They've benefited from the system and the status quo. They're doing quite well, so they don't really get why everyone else can't just get behind it and benefit from it too. So they're our third group. Our fourth group are the sceptical scrollers, who are kind of digitally native, and they kind of really started to emerge during COVID. They're actually the youngest group, and they're very much online and getting lots of their news online. They're disengaged from politics. They're trying they don't really follow it in the traditional sense that you'd expect people like. They're not watching BBC News, etc. They're seeking out influencers on Instagram or on X or on YouTube, and that's how they're getting their news. And they feel like the system's not really working for them. They're disillusioned. So I don't want to go as far to say they're depoliticised, because they are politicised. They're just getting their politics in a very non-traditional way.
So they're not reading the FT?
Yeah, they're not reading the FT. And this is where they're susceptible to some radicalisation, potentially, depending on who they're listening to and who their algorithms are throwing up next for them. But that's a very good way. Yeah, definitely not in The Guardian or the FT. And then we have our rooted patriots, who are much fought over electoral body, and they're mainly in the so-called Red Wall, which stretches across northern England. So we've heard lots about them. They've had lots of media coverage throughout the last few elections. And the reason they have done is because they are kind of a floating voter. they have very strong views. They kind of lean left economically, right socially on their values, and that doesn't really change. But the party's offerings have been changing to try and tailor towards them. So when you think the past few elections, 2019, the Red Wall went to the Conservative Party, then they went back in 2024 to Labour, and then at last month's local elections, we saw them shift heavily towards reform. So it depends who's speaking to them in the right way at the time. They're willing to go for them, and they are really annoyed and they're disillusioned. They want change, and they've been promised change at each of those 3 stages, and they're not getting it. So they're really, let's roll the dice again. Let's see who will deliver it.
Is there a big overlap with that particular segment and I suppose the kind of Brexit core?
Yes, definitely. So they would have voted Brexit in 2016 heavily. And this is kind of why they're susceptible and will look to Nigel Farage and think, oh, yeah, might as well roll the dice on him now. And then our last 2 segments are the traditional Conservatives, very much name is what it says on the tin. They're very nostalgic, kind of in a different way to the established Liberals. They kind of also like institutions, but they kind of think, oh, things were better back in the good old days, and maybe we do need some change, whereas the established Liberals are like, let's keep the system and the status quo there. And they're a bit wary of reform, but actually now are leaning towards them. So traditional Conservatives, they're kind of the base of the Conservative Party, and that's a big concern for them if they are leaning reform now. And then our very last group are the dissenting disruptors, who are the people that lean right and want to tear it all down. This system's not working, let's just flip the monopoly ball now. They think multiculturalism has failed the country and it's not really worked, and they think there needs to be a big change, and they have heavily gone to reform. And at the last election, they were the one segment that were leaning towards the Reform Party. Now, actually, Reform have 4 of those segments, so there's been big shifts now. I think sometimes when we're talking about the dissenting disruptors, you kind of have an image in your head of who these people are. We've tried to split them up even further, segmenting our segments. And I think people would love to jump and say, oh my God, these people must all be racist. And there is a segment in there that hold many racist views, and they are, when you talk about immigration, they want to sink the boats and they jump to the most extreme. Politics shouldn't write off this segment. There are people who they can win their views over, and they are more, there are reluctant radicals in there who really want to change the system, and they're looking at reform, but that's because that's the people that are going to offer them change at this stage, and they could be won back over there.
Do you have a sense of how those groups are distributed across the population in terms of like percentage of the whole? So is it the case that there's this kind of, the group of kind of centrist liberals are shrinking, or like how do they relate in size as a cohort to some of the other segments? Is there one segment that's much bigger than the others, or is it relatively evenly distributed?
So it is. The incrementalists left are the biggest segment. I think they're about a quarter of the public. But then your established Liberals, rooted patriots, and your traditional Conservatives, they're the 4 big ones, essentially. And then you have your smaller segments there. But that is shifting. So we need to keep updating the segments and seeing how people, in this fragmented era, how people are being pushed to the extremes as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's such a fascinating piece of work, because I think it really digs down to a little bit further into the kind of deeper attitudes or predispositions that voters have that aren't just maybe reflective of their household income or their age, and it digs a little bit further into that. I suppose it'd be good to talk a little bit now more specifically about younger people and what they're saying about politics. So we spend at IF a lot of time thinking about all the different economic challenges that are facing younger people. So obviously the housing crisis, student debt, insecure work, and just broader pressures on living standards. But I'm interested, I suppose, the extent to which, and if so, how these kinds of pressures are showing up politically in younger people's views. So from the research you've done at More in Common, what's the kind of sense of what younger people are saying about politics at the moment? And in particular, what issues are cropping up as the ones that feel most urgent or pressing for them?
Mm-hmm. You'll be relieved to hear those are all coming up. I guess young people are no different from the rest of the population in they're also pissed off. They also think politics is failing, and that's not unique to young people. That is spread across the whole population. Everyone thinks politics is failing them. But when you dig into what's driving that with young people, like you say, that is there are some different motivations. And when people are being pushed to the extremes, as I've been saying, we are seeing deprivation is pushing people there, whether that's reform, people going to the reform, or people going to the Green Party. The councils and wards they were winning at last month's local elections were some of the most deprived in the country. But there's kind of two different types of deprivation, and the people, so young people in London, for example, the Greens did really well last month, and they're being pushed to them, and they are deprived because they can get a good job in London, but they can't get a good house. Whereas deprivation in the rest of the country is, I can get a good house, but I can't get a good job where I'm living. So deprivation is playing out in different ways there. But young people specifically are hyper aware of housing, and renting comes up constantly. They're very worried about that, and rents just increasing, and that pushing them to the edge of what they can afford. And some of these people are kind of metropolitan in London, in city centres, not being paid too badly, but they're saying most of it's going actually on my rent, and what am I left with at the end there? Then they are also, what we've been seeing cropping up in the past few months due to campaigning on the issue, is the topic around student loans, and just how that wasn't coming up spontaneously at all. I think most young people kind of accepted before, I have a student loan, I'm paying it off, it's in my paycheck. But now all of a sudden it's been in the media, people have actually gone and dug into it. I have myself, and I've been like, what on earth? Then they're also, young people are much more liberal and progressive, essentially. When you're looking at 18 to 24-year-olds, the vast majority are voting for left-leaning parties, way more than the rest of the public. And they're concerned about some of these narratives that they think the rest of the population are speaking about. They broadly can see the benefits of multiculturalism and have grown up in a multicultural society where their friendship groups are very ethnically diverse. They're not worried about it. And they get concerned about some of the things that they hear other segments of society talking about, and that kind of is driving some concerns and kind of some of this intergenerational tension, I would say. And that's not necessarily people saying, oh, it's older people in general that are doing this. People are saying, oh, it's dinner when I have dinner with my parents. They say some really troubling stuff, and I want to try and tackle them on that. So that's coming up too.
What about some of the other issues? Like, I think perhaps this is more something from 5 to 10 years ago, but amongst younger people being concerned about things like climate change. That's really seemed to, like, at least in the current zeitgeist and discussion amongst younger people, it's when I've been reading some articles and analysis, that really seems to have slipped off younger people's radars now, and their focus is much more on material or bread and butter issues of, can I get a good job? Will that job be enabled me to be able to pay my rent? Is there any reasonable prospect of me being able to save for a house deposit and potentially start a family? So it feels like there's been a shift, perhaps, and I could be wrong, from more meta issues, bigger societal issues, into more inwardly focused issues on cost of living, jobs, housing. Is that a fair characterisation?
I think, yeah, it is a fair characterisation, and especially what's coming up spontaneously. And when we poll amongst young people, the number one issue by a country mile is the cost of living. But that's not to say they're not concerned about the climate. I guess the cost of living has just got worse and has become all-consuming, and they've kind of given up hope that it's ever going to end. When we poll generally across the public, we have 2/3 that just think the cost of living is going to just continue spiralling and spiralling forever. So it kind of has become all-consuming in that way. But that's not to say when you get young people in a focus group and you're speaking about the climate that they're not really concerned about it. They are. Just like you say, there's competing priorities now almost. And you see that also play out when you think about international affairs and everything that's going on. Young people over-indexed on being concerned about what's happening in the Middle East with Palestine and Gaza and Israel. And they will talk about it extensively, but still the big issue for them is the cost of living.
Interesting. I have some questions now about something we talk about a lot, which is this idea of perhaps like a broken social contract in society, an expectation, a reasonable expectation of a relatively secure life. You could get a house, pay some taxes. If you needed social services, you could rely upon them, and you would have stable employment. And I think a lot of young people, at least that we speak to, are getting the sense that that kind of promise and that sense of reciprocity of you do the right things and you get these things in return, that kind of promise has been weakened, perhaps over time, and it feels much less attainable. So in your research, do you ever explicitly get younger people speaking about or get this sense of the social contract being under pressure?
Yep, we also love to speak to people about the social contract. So snap there. Something that stands out is actually we were in Wales for the devolved elections that happened last month, and we were speaking to some young people about the social contract. And we first asked this exact question to them, basically, and the first response was like, "What is the social contract?" And a good check to get out of our lingo that we always use. But then when we gave the explanation that you basically gave, it was just laughter. Like, yeah, no, that's not happening anymore. Like, people are feeling really strained and that it's completely broken. They're paying more and more in tax, and just not getting public services aren't improving in a way that they can recognise. But for young people specifically, I would say, is that they feel like they're paying more and more in tax, but they're also less likely to even need to use these public services. So they're getting all this pressure put on them, and that is helping wider society. But they're saying, well, actually, I use the NHS rarely. So yes, definitely widespread that they feel like the system has just fallen apart, essentially. Then it also ties into this feeling that they have kind of a lack of agency to do anything now. When we ask people about hard work, the majority now say hard work in this country doesn't pay. So you can go out and graft, but I'm not necessarily seeing the benefits of that. And people more broadly, especially young people, feel this lack of agency now. One more bill could destroy all their financial planning, essentially. And they feel like they're really living on the precipice, and life just feels a bit more uncertain now.
Is that leading to any extent of broader dissatisfaction with democracy? So if you have a sense that the social contract is broken or it's not working, are you picking up any sense that then that leads people to be more sceptical or disaffected with democracy as a system of government? I suppose another thing would be if that's kind of leading to some greater support for attitudes about the need for more authoritarian style of politics to get things done.
I don't think, when we're speaking to people, I don't think they're immediately going that meta and jumping out and thinking, yes, democracy itself, we need to tweak and go more authoritarian. But what we are seeing is a new axis forming, and kind of what I was talking to about the 7 segments, where people think we actually should be preserving institutions on one end, and then the other end saying, tear it all down and start again. And that's not necessarily tear it all down and we don't have democracy anymore. But they do want to tear it all down and kind of change how the country is running. They're fed up of politicians, essentially, and this lack of trust in politicians is really rich. One quote that sticks out to me from a recent focus group is, someone said, the last person with good intentions to enter Parliament was Guy Fawkes. Bring him back, I'll help him. So there is kind of this strong discontentment, and especially towards politicians as a whole, the lack of trust in politicians is widespread. Fewer than 1 in 5 would trust a politician to watch their wallet or handbag if they were to go somewhere, which is completely crazy. And people are fed up, and it's kind of reinforced by some of these scandals that have keep cropping up, and that explains partly why people are so disappointed with this Labour government and Keir Starmer, because he promised the people the opposite. He said, "You've had this with the Conservative Party. I'm
different.
Yeah, I'm going to respect you. Politics is going to tread more lightly on your life," and actually they haven't delivered that. From straight away, I think people still bring up the Freebiegate scandal that happened right at the start of his government, but then the Mandelson scandal recently has really hammered that home. And actually more people now say there's chaos under the Labour Party than the previous Conservative Party. And this is just forcing people to look at something more radical. So I don't want to jump and say, yes, they want authoritarianism in this country, but people are really starting to question how the system is working and whether it is working for them.
Do you have any sense of whether the lack of trust in politicians, because that's a remarkable finding about the 1 in 5, is it worse in the UK than other relevant kind of countries? So do you pick up anything Is it the case that this is just a universal trend across Europe and other established democracies in Canada, Australia, New Zealand? Or is there something particular to the British case where voters are much more fed up with democratic politics than elsewhere?
So when you're looking at Western societies, I would say that what's unique about Britain is the relative change that's happened quite quickly over the past decade or so towards distrust in politicians. But that's not to say, like, France has hated their politicians for years. So I don't want to jump and say, actually, it is specifically unique to Britain. But I think the depths we've plummeted to of trust in politicians, and when I was saying earlier, the good thing about surveys is you can overlook across long-term trends. And actually, when you look back there at some surveys that have been running for decades, it is at an all-time low now. So something is happening here that is kind of unique in how quickly it's transpired, this distrust in them.
So with this trend of declining trust in politicians, are there differences between different generations or different age groups? So you're seeing the case that the steepest declines in trust in politicians and the political system have been amongst younger people? Are older people still relatively trustful?
Everyone is distrusting of politicians, but I think what's interesting is that young people used to, as you entered the electorate and entered Poland, used to start off, okay, fairly trustworthy, and then your experience of politics would mean, you'd taper off and you'd start losing hope. Whereas we're seeing young people enter the electorate now just immediately distrusting of politicians, which is, I think, a really interesting change there. And going back to the segments, yes, there are segments that will still trust politicians, like the incrementalist left and established liberals are still, on the whole, more willing to back the status quo. But yeah, it is quite pervasive across different age cohorts, this distrust.
And is that, just digging a bit deeper on that, is there a distinction as well between trust in politicians and political elites and trust in broader institutions in British society? So institutions like the BBC, NHS.
Yes, so I think this is the danger, right, that this distrust seeps out, and there is some residual leftover trust in these institutions, but we are seeing general declines across the board in, like, Parliament or the civil service happening, or the BBC, but it's not to the same extent that has happened with politicians at the minute. Politicians, when we poll them, are now less trusted than journalists, which hasn't been a trend we've seen more broadly over the past few years. So it's been a really steep decline for them, but it's starting to seep out into these wider civil society.
It's fascinating. I think it'd be great to get a sense from you of why younger voters in particular are turning away from mainstream political parties. And obviously we've spoken about how there's a bit of a leftward shift amongst particularly inner city younger people towards the Greens. There's also somewhat of a shift in some other areas more towards reform. How should we what's the best way to understand this kind of fragmentation amongst younger voters? I think we've spoken about the extent to which there are different aspects of material circumstances that are driving this. But yeah, what's your view on the best way to understand why younger people are fragmenting away from mainstream political parties?
So my main point would be they're going because of the cost of living and economic deprivation, as I've touched upon. But I also think what's interesting is that their willingness to go to different parties, they have less stickiness or loyalty to the traditional parties. They feel less like they owe them something. So I think what's interesting is when you speak to older generations who are now switching to Reform or whoever, they're saying, I'm doing this with quite a heavy heart because I voted Labour for all my life and my mum did the same, so this is a big shift for me. Young people are just a bit more volatile in the electorate and feel they're not necessarily looking at the Labour Party and think, I should be voting for you because of X, Y, Z previously. And you've got to remember these people have grown up under the 14 years of the Conservative Party and now have seen Labour promise them change and they're not necessarily seeing this change, so are just willing to look elsewhere. What I thought was interesting is I did a group with people that had switched to Green Party voters in inner London after the local elections. And what they were saying is very much, I've been driven to the Greens. I quite like Zach Polanski. He seems to speak and has solutions that I want to hear. So I'm coming to them because of the cost of living, and I actually agree that we need to tax the wealthiest, etc. So I've been switched to him. But what's interesting now is I can actually see the Greens can win in my area. Like, the Greens can take Hackney, Lambeth, etc. And I think what's going to be interesting at the next election is how much they take that forward, where we often talk about, as you get to an election, actually, the electorate will squeeze back to the main parties because there can only be one, there's only the option of two prime ministers at the end of the day. And I think that attitude is just different, and especially amongst young people who are much more, we call it the Netflixication of politics. Don't like this one, I'll stop it and go on to the next. And they're much more diverse and willing to jump from party to party.
I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on polarisation amongst young people in particular. So obviously you're starting to see a move away from the centre ground, but also perhaps in some respects maybe a hardening of attitudes across the electorate more broadly. And obviously there's always going to be divisive topics and issues within the public debate. But I'd be curious to get a sense from you, amongst younger cohorts in particular, how deep is the kind of sense of polarisation? Because you've seen, I'm sure, articles about, younger women becoming much more kind of progressive, young men perhaps less so.
So I think there's some polarisation. If we're to go back to the segments, the two youngest segments are the progressive activists and your sceptical scrollers, and they are very different. Your sceptical scrollers are your digital natives, and your progressive activists have very different concerns in how they're campaigning and how they're driven by topics like the climate, etc. And they don't necessarily see eye to eye, and both of them can have quite a misunderstanding view of the other, I would say. So there's one view there, but then also, like you were saying, within gender, we're seeing this more and more at the last election. Looking at women 18 to 24, around a quarter voted for the Green Party, compared 1 in 26% voted for reform, whereas amongst men in the same age cohort, they were more evenly split. So around 12% went to the Greens, 12% went to reform there. So women are more progressive. I think the commentariat and in the media, they take that figure of young men and kind of it fits a narrative, right? And it can get blown up and say, oh, men are on their trudge towards right wing. But I guess what is different and what is justified there is that it's a split we haven't really seen before. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. When you look at, people have done analysis, when you look at how the generations entered the electorate, more or less there's not been a gender split. Everyone enters fairly left wing and gets more right wing as you get older. But this is an interesting split, interesting amongst young men. What's driving it is when I think a pervasive sense of disillusionment amongst young men. And when we ask them what the biggest issue facing them is, it's they're concerned about job opportunities and a willingness, potential to provide for a family in the future. When you ask young women what the biggest issue facing young men is, they say their mental health. That's they're not even getting up there on they must be concerned about job opportunities or provide provision for a family. They're still young men, but we're seeing that pull through as the top issues. And then I think on social media, they're on algorithms and they're getting clips of telling them what a man should be doing, and they're being pushed further towards alternatives, whereas young women aren't necessarily.
I wanted to pick up on something you said there, because I think in the past, the kind of general view amongst political scientists and others would be that often young people, they're idealistic, perhaps, if you're uncharitable, might say naive, and they start out in politics often being more progressive or left-wing, and then over the course of one's life, when you then start to become perhaps a property owner, start to have children, there's generally a tendency for your kind of relevant generational cohort to start to become more conservative over time. That's not always true, but that thing in broad terms. I suppose I'm curious now, are you seeing a difference, particularly I'm thinking about for the cohort of millennials and maybe Gen Z who've maybe had a few general elections. Are you seeing that similar trend as you would expect over the life, of course, for people to become slightly more conservative. Does that still hold true, or are people, because of these things that, well, you can't buy a house and you can't start a family, because you're kind of prevented from doing so, you don't have this conservative drift?
You've hit the nail on the head, essentially. So when you look, zoom back and see it, you are still seeing that progressive, that gradual shift to the right wing, but the point at which it's happening is getting older and older as people's life experiences are changing, and because they're buying houses later, having kids later. That is playing through, and we are seeing that happen.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It'll be one of those interesting ones over the next decade or two to see how that plays out to reshape the political landscape. So we've spoken about, I suppose, the attitudes of voters, particularly younger people, what issues motivate them, what they're concerned about, but want to turn to thinking about when it comes to voting and turning out to vote and how that shapes political incentives for parties. And I think one of our views is that if there is an extent to which politicians and political parties tend to be more responsive to the interests and preferences of older age groups. And in part, that's because older people are much, much more likely to vote. And they're often, in particular, just the raw demographics of they're a large cohort size. The baby boomer cohort is quite large. Whereas for younger people, slightly smaller cohort sizes, often very mobile, so they might not be in one place. They might be moving around electorates. It's hard to register. It's always been the case that younger people have turned out less than older people, but has that actually decreased over the last few general elections? Yeah,
so turnout generally has decreased in the last few general elections, and the last election was the lowest turnout in about 25 years. It was around 3 and 5. But yeah, again, hit the nail on the head. Politics, if you see it in an economics perspective, there's like supply and demand, right? And if the supply of the electorate is older people, the product will be, here's something to suit old people, so you vote us again in the future. And you do see that play out in politics, whether just thinking about policies like the triple lock, which is it's starting to enter debate now about whether that is sustainable. But I would imagine you'd have to be a very bold politician to go and annoy the older electorate like that when they are such a powerful voting bloc. And I would say that's a real consideration to how people are thinking about how they develop policies. Other things like the free bus pass, free TV licenses, winter fuel, exactly. And actually, that was quite a bold thing for Labour to come in and do. And I would say what was interesting is on winter fuel, pensioners were obviously annoyed about it because something was being taken from them, but it didn't play out in the way you'd expect intergenerational change. Like, young people weren't like putting two fingers up to old people and saying, well, you get so much. They were actually sympathised and were concerned about older people, and lots of people spoke about like personal experiences of knowing that their gran or granddad can't put the heating on and is laid up with blankets in focus groups. That was coming out quite strongly. People across the board were concerned there. So there is a thing about supply and demand, but then also just how across society we view older people and want to protect them or help them there. So I think there's something to overcome there. But definitely it's a consideration. And like you said, people can say, oh, this election will be different because we will get young, if we can just get young people to turn out, then we will get swaths behind us and we'll be swept into power. But there's a structural problem, right? The Electoral Commission, I've done research for them in the past, where just young people are amongst the most likely to even be registered because they are so mobile, like you said. They're more likely to be private renters and jumping about from different houses each time. And actually, like a friend of mine, I won't name him, he works with us, highly politicised, as you imagine. He works at More in Common, moved to London fairly recently and had forgot to register to vote at the local election. So it's just like inconveniences like that, essentially. So there needs to be something broader that just brings young people into the electorate and makes it easier for them to register to vote.
Do you think votes at 16 will change that?
Potentially, but I actually think something more radical and interesting would be auto-enrolment onto the electoral register, where if you move house and you have to pay your council tax, you give that information to the government, and then they just know you live there and you're auto-enrolled onto the electoral register, rather than this physical, like, oh, I have to go and be changing it. Like, it could happen when you pay your TV license. Like, they know where we are to send us a letter about the TV license, but not necessarily just to assume we can vote there. I think Votes at 16 will be interesting in terms of bringing people into politics at kind of a younger age, and maybe there could be more education at school. What I would imagine would happen is actually you might get a uptick into, this is just like an anecdote, not that I've seen. I imagine 16-year-olds might vote a bit more than 17, 18, 19-year-olds, just because there'll be excitement behind it, and school, and it will be like a school thing, right?
What do you think about compulsory voting? So I'm an Australian, we have compulsory voting, and I'm a huge proponent of it for many reasons. But on these particular issues, because it's compulsory voting, our turnout rates for younger generations are super high, basically above 90% for the most part. And we've seen in the last few elections in Australia the extent to which that has placed significant pressures on both parties to try and make additional policy offerings for younger people. So the Labor Party promised to cut student debt by 20%, fix how our student loans were indexed, and they've just put out a budget all about intergenerational equality and reforming housing and property taxes for younger generations. So I suppose that's a really concrete example where you've got compulsory voting. Now younger voters are starting to basically numerically outnumber older voters, and you suddenly start to see a government release a budget that's all about intergenerational equity, basically out of nowhere. A lot of people saying that's just down to the raw electoral calculus. Yeah. So that's my argument to you. What are your thoughts on, would you ever conceive of a world in which the UK moves to compulsory voting? And then two, independently of the practicalities, do you think compulsory voting would be a good thing to try and rectify some of these inequalities in participation?
Yep. I'll take your second question first. I think it would be a good thing, essentially, to rectify this specific question, like you've said, and draw upon topics in Australia. So yes, I think this would be one way to help rectify the problem of supply and demand in terms of who's voting for who. It's funny, in focus groups, when you speak to people, they are more likely to say, who can we disenfranchise? These people shouldn't be allowed to vote, rather than compulsory voting. So I think you'd have an uphill battle, potentially, in persuading the British electorate of it, but I don't think it would be impossible to overcome. And yeah, British people, more recently, when I think back to like COVID, etc., they loved doing whatever the government told them to do in the polling. If there was a ban, go, we support this. Every time the government would be worried and think, oh, like maybe we've gone too far, and they'd support it.
Yeah, I think it would be one of the. Obviously, it's interesting speaking because it's just part of our political culture. So on the elections are always on a weekend. It's really easy to register.
I mean, that's another thing, right?
Yeah.
Why are elections always on a Thursday? Yeah.
I found that remarkable when I moved to this country.
Well, how long has it been compulsory voting in Australia now?
Off the top of my head, I couldn't say, but it's been for many, many, many decades. And basically, it's like there will still be people who don't vote, and some people will just go in and do what we call like a donkey vote, just the 1, 2, 3, 4.
I think that's something that will come out quite strongly if it were introduced. People would want like a none of the above option. Yeah. Like rather than like not just spoil my ballot, I want to say no, all of them are rubbish.
The protest vote.
Yeah, because that's what we see in Poland, right? When we're pushing people to say who would be the best party on this issue, none of the above will often win. So yeah, people will want that, whether that's spoil the ballot or a protest vote. And what is the fine in Australia?
It's pretty small, but it's basically just enough to be a bit of a nuisance. And mostly it's down to social pressure and cultural norms that everyone just votes. I think it works really well. You go and get a democracy sausage on election day. There's like sausage sizzles and drinks and stuff. It's a lovely community of thing. So
hot dogs at polling stations rather than dogs at polling stations. Yeah.
Given we've spoken a bit about fragmentation and polarisation, I think a lot of that sometimes reflects, I suppose, a bit of a zero-sum thinking amongst some people, in that there's a kind of pot of resources or things, and it's either young people versus old people to an extent, or citizens versus immigrants, and perhaps there's an extent to which, just because there's these pressures on living standards, economic growth is really slow, it turns into a bit of a kind of zero-sum contest amongst different groups in the population. Thinking about politics in zero-sum terms is something that can be overcome, and can it only be addressed if living standards start to rise again?
So I would actually challenge the narrative a bit, because when we're doing focus groups, older people aren't there saying, I mean, maybe like one or two have a stereotype of young people and think they're lazy, whatever, etc. Like a picture of Gen Z in their head, like why can't they just go back to the office? But actually, more broadly, people are really concerned about young people, as you have older people saying like they're connected to their grandkids or their children, and they're really worried about their future, and they've clocked onto this idea that young people are actually emigrating more now to other countries, and they're worried whether they will be able to build a future in the country in a way that they've been able to. So old people aren't necessarily coming at it and being like, young people over here, they're the problem. And again, that winter fuel allowance is another example of where young people aren't necessarily being like, well, old people are the problem. So I think there's more cohesion than you would think on this topic. And yeah, I think there's foundations to build consensus. And actually, when you look at policies that are designed to help young people, something like apprenticeships or the work experience placements that have just been announced after the Milburn Review, they get some of their biggest support amongst older people who want these they're more so the younger people who are a bit less politicised for the reasons we've discussed. Older people are actually like, yes, this is good, let's help them. They want to help them. There's a kind of joke amongst focus groupers that one of the most popular things you can ask people about is apprenticeships. People are like, yes, solution for everything. Or youth clubs as well, which you touched upon at the start. Yeah, that is focus group catnip. People are like, yes, this is what we want. So there is this desire to help young people and want to introduce policies. So it's there, and I think you could, to go back to where I started, you can use focus groups to how you create a compelling narrative about that and bring people along with you.
Obviously, we've covered a lot of ground today, but I think thinking about it a little bit more broadly, how you see the landscape of intergenerational fairness in the UK today. So I suppose from your perspective, you're thinking about how it kind of reflects through on people's political attitudes, their voting intentions. But yeah, thinking about those underlying material conditions that are driving it, what are your broader reflections on the state of intergenerational fairness?
Yes, so I would say young people have a harsh deal essentially, and they've realised they have a harsh deal, and they are speaking about it quite openly. They agree that the social contract's broken, and they can point towards examples of where they're putting into the state but not necessarily taking out. So they're very aware of that, and when you, like just the discussion we've been having about the policies, it's quite clear that lots have been designed to target old people and try and win their vote over. But I don't necessarily think it should be reduced to this is another tension or two groups going at one another. And like I was saying, I actually think this is something where you can build consensus. It will be difficult, and I think a reality will be that the triple lock needs to be looked at in some years to come, because it's going to become unsustainable financially, and I think there'll be a big battle about that.
Well, maybe picking up on that, if you were lucky enough to be chosen, you were taken from your current role and placed into number 10, and you were asked to advise the government on 1-2 kind of like practical reforms that would help improve intergenerational fairness, equity more broadly, what are kind of 1-2 things you would recommend?
Yeah, so I don't want to sound like a broken record, but you've won me over on compulsory voting. I actually think that would be a systematic thing that would actually address the problem across the board and change the way that politicians think about voters, essentially. So, yeah, I would actually tinker with the voting system a bit, whether it might not be compulsory voting, but like auto-enrolment, like I was saying, I think is a big thing, a big technical thing they can do, which would just overcome one barrier to... We know turnout's low amongst young people. What's one thing we could do to just try and make it easier for them to vote? From focus groups, if I was reporting from what they're saying, it is something to do with rent and how can you just help people make it more affordable to be living in places where they feel they need to live to get a good job, essentially. I know a rent cap was floated like a few months ago. I think it was a bit of a kite that the government were flying. And actually in focus groups spontaneously that came up as like really popular amongst young people, or something that they wanted or something that they could buy into.
Perhaps more popular among focus groups than economists.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I think that's a good place to end on. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a fascinating conversation. If you've enjoyed today's episode, you can also find more episodes in our podcast feed. You can also find us online at if.org.uk or on Instagram at Intergenerational Foundation, and you can find Cameron's contacts in the show notes as well.